Okay, well, it's been quite a day. I think that we have learned a lot about the school, and I don't think we should wait until another 25 years has passed to learn more about the school. I've been looking forward to this for quite a while. I think this is a pretty unique opportunity to actually get inside the minds of three deans of the faculty and to really talk about how they think about some very broad issues that relate to education, to the university, to the city, and the world. I know the three of them very, very well. I had the privilege, I think, of being on the search committees for all three of them in succession. And I'd say that with Larry, we were really starting from almost degree zero. It was really about a reinvention and a total reimagining of what a School of Architecture landscape design could be. And I think I really want to acknowledge the fact that the first builder after that ground zero was Larry, and Larry is just extraordinary. I've known him for so long in many, many ways. Let's just say this. When he came, and I think we're outside the limit of statutes limitations, but his recommenders were Rem Koolhaus, Adele Friedman, and Phyllis Lambert, and that immediately sent a signal that he was interested in a kind of broader international idea about design that would connect Toronto, this university, to the world. And I think that, and he will speak, I hope, about his thinking and what was actually put in place. With George, Baird is a key figure in the life of the school. He's someone who I have known as a teacher. He's a friend, a colleague, a collaborator, one of the smartest people I know, absolutely. I've learned so much from him, especially about, thinking about architecture in a cultural context, thinking about architecture in the city. And, it's amazing. I was so happy when George came back from Harvard and took over the leadership of the school. Richard Sommer is an American, and in that idea...
So is Larry, by the way.
So is Larry, but we modified him. Richard is still an American with all of the strengths of really wanting to build and to do something. And I think all three of them have taken different positions on how to create a great school. So the first question really is, what makes a great school? And I threw it out here just to be argumentative or to provoke a discussion. I would say it's great faculty. I mean, I think that that's the first order of business. So I want each of you to maybe give a really short, everyone knows a lot about you, but maybe an insight into how you thought about what you wanted to create as a faculty, the people. Larry.
I start. Okay. Well, yes, faculty is absolutely key. You do have to have great faculty. You also have to have great students. And it's sort of chicken and egg, isn't it? I mean, the students come to a school because they're looking for great faculty, and to recruit faculty, they want great students to teach. So it's a combination, really, of great faculty and great students. How do I look at what do I think about when I think about great schools, or what did I have in mind when I came here in '97? I think, first of all, a School of Architecture is a community. It's a very complex community, and it's part of larger communities, the university, the city, the alums. So you have to kind of look simultaneously at all of these layers and kind of get the community in sync. And then I think you have to create a situation, and it takes a lot of people to do it, but you have to create a situation where there's a framework of security, trust, open inquiry, and extremely high standards. And I have to say, you mentioned Phyllis Lambert, and certainly Phyllis Lambert was one of the people that I was fortunate to work with and be around. And the standards, Phyllis's standards, we all know, had a big impact on me. So, those high standards are so important. But I think once you kind of lay a groundwork, a framework, then the creativity can start to unfold in a place that feels secure, optimistic, and with those, with very high expectations. And it's ultimately, isn't it, about the kind of release of individual creativity. It's the creativity of the collective, the place. But finally, it's about individuals being able to blossom and to do his or her distinctive thing. So you have to create this very special support framework. So what I tried to do from 97 onward was to lay a deep foundation, a new foundation that other people could build on. Because it takes a long time to create a great school of architecture, and I was very fortunate that I had a lot of things and fell into place in a good way. And then George and Richard, and it's very rewarding to see that foundation now truly blossoming.
George, when you were a candidate to be the next dean, I want you to know that you had unanimous support by the faculty. Unanimous. It was an extraordinary thing, and I think they felt there was a certain sense of confidence that your return to Toronto would create the right atmosphere for the school to take a big step. I want you to talk about things you did with the faculty, and how you invested in them, the kinds of, I think there are issues of gender balance in the faculty. Just talk about your faculty.
Well, I will do that, but before I do that, let me say thank you for the compliment about the unanimity. I recently introduced Peter Eisenman at an ACSA conference where he was going to receive the Topaz Medallion after we had struggled for 4 years to finally get an ACSA AIA selection committee to finally agree to give it to him. And so on that occasion, I was known to observe that evidently I had fewer enemies than he did. It would seem the same thing applies in this case. The plain truth is that Larry had done such a good job of hiring people, quite a lot of them, that I did not actually do as much hiring as he did. I did do some, and I certainly was happy with the appointments that I made. But most of my time, as far as faculty is concerned, I spent more time shepherding the tenure cases of Larry's appointments through the tenure process than I did on making new appointments of my own. And I'm pleased to be able to report that on the occasion when President Naylor came to the school to make the public announcement of the first gift of $14 million to the school by John Daniels, he muttered to one of the faculty in the kind of melee before the formal event convened that the tenure cases coming from architecture were way above average across the university as a whole. So, and that came from the president of the university. So there's no question.
And he was tough. He's a
yes, that's also true. So we do have a formidable faculty, so I agree with everything that Larry said. But and of course you won't get the students if you don't have the faculty. But I would just add a couple of other points to it, which is there's a question about the composition of it. I mean, you want to have a stream of faculty that are fairly strongly oriented to practice, That's harder to sustain in architectural education nowadays, but I think it remains tremendously important. You also want to have a stream of faculty that are not so oriented to practice, but who are design teachers, not scholars. And you also want to have scholars that are strongly committed in a traditional academic way to the parameters of their discipline, such as you would find in building science or history and theory. An architecture school needs all of those, and as Larry has already said, it also needs all of them to get along reasonably well together. I don't know whether it's an advantage or a handicap, but a fundamental, not only am I not an American, like my two colleagues here, but
Dual.
but I have another defining characteristic which separates me off radically from the two of them, and that is that I've been associated with this school since 1957. So boy, is there not a lot of history there. So, and of course not all of that history was smooth sailing, and the faculty did not always get along so collaboratively. But in recent times, it certainly has done so. And I will just conclude by saying, here's a bit of tawdry boasting for you. In my time at Harvard, I learned, one of the things you can say about the Graduate School of Design at Harvard is that it's a kind of finishing school for architecture students for the whole world. Because people, because the first professional degree at Harvard is a master's, and then there's a second professional degree available after that. And so people, even though they already have an architectural education, people come to Harvard to get some more architectural education and get the particular Harvard version of it. U of T is not quite there, but I do think it is true because we now have the professional degree at the master's level, and I don't know if the older alumni here are aware of this, we are now the metropolitan school for Eastern Canada. So people come from as far east as Montreal and as far west as Winnipeg. Beyond this too, but I mean statistically large numbers from all of Eastern Canada to complete their already begun architectural education here. We are now that kind of a draw, and we are that kind of a draw because of our faculty.
Richard, I think one of the things that would be really helpful for the audience is to just understand the kind of organization of the school as it is right now. I don't think everyone knows all of the pieces of the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, Art, Design, the whole. Give us a snapshot of the pieces.
So let me say, when I came, I had taught at 5 different schools of architecture, including being a colleague of George's for a decade. We overlapped for 5 years at Harvard, and this is a very unique opportunity for me to come and lead a school that, in a sense, now we know is the oldest school of architecture in Canada, one of the oldest in North America, but because of this history, in a way, one of the newest in terms of the vitality and strength and youth of its faculty, especially its full-time faculty. So when I arrived, I immediately got into a slightly schizophrenic situation where I would say, because I see my role as the dean as sort of advocating for the school externally, I would say, well, Larry and George built this incredible chassis, this car, and I intend to take it for a big drive. And I've tried to do that, but I realized at the time that there were some misalignments between the incredible vision that Larry put into place to make this school, along with all the other professional schools at University of Toronto, an elite graduate program on par with something like Princeton or Yale or Harvard or Berkeley, who all have these freestanding graduate, all their professional programs at their graduate level, and the place of this faculty in a very large research university, and how you make an independent faculty of, let's say, 350 students survive. So when I arrived, I realized that, and I already knew from my previous experience, that there is a bit of a challenge with these graduate programs, and it exists at Harvard and other places like it, where if you only have students at the school for 3 years or 3.5 years, it's a very short period of time to convey an architectural education. And so the broadness and plurality and diversity that we've been celebrating today can sometimes be challenging when you have all of these accreditation requirements and the requirement to deliver a professional program in that compressed period of time. So that was one reason I thought, well, how are we going to continue to extend and amplify and strengthen this urbanistic interdisciplinary school when we have this pressure in both the landscape architecture and architecture program to deliver a professional foundation in a short period of time. And that points then, there were other, by the way, structural challenges having to do with our budget, that there wasn't enough of one. I'll just give you one metric, by the way. Bruce, I'm going to take a little digression here. Bruce was on the interview when I interviewed here, and I gave a very, very egg-headed talk where I talked about the history of architectural education and the split in the 70s between architecture going towards the hard and social sciences and then towards the arts and humanities, and how that all should bring us to a place where architecture schools should have should be able to have a stronger position in research universities than ever, right? And I took about 15 minutes to give this long oration, really, and it's a miracle that they hired me. But
I would say your big advantage is your voice.
Our provost at the time, Cheryl Missack, was a philosopher of American pragmatism, and I think that actually helped. But when I got here, I realized I couldn't get directly to these pedagogical questions, and that we had to literally reconfigure the infrastructure of the school and make it something bigger, which is to lay claim to undergraduate teaching that we were already doing, that Larry had initiated as really a kind of liberal arts-based program in the Faculty of Arts and Science, pull that into the school, make a new foundation in undergraduate teaching, keep our professional programs as still the core of the school, and then ultimately raise the ceiling for PhD and postgraduate studies, so that we would have all levels of study, and our complexity and our plurality could actually be strengthened by this large undergraduate program and by the ability to look at complex issues at a postgraduate level. So that was what I figured out about within 3 months of here we had to do, and I got the university to go along with us to do that, because it helped by making the faculty larger, increasing our enrollment, and drawing in programs. And when I started to discuss having architectural studies be a part of the faculty, because it belonged to our now president's faculty, the Faculty of Arts and Science, that Merrick Gertler was the head of, the dean of at the time. I said, you know what? It seems like our visual studies program is not happy with the Faculty of Arts and Science either. So we want to take their home at One Spadina. Why don't you let them come with us? And so we've done all those things. So the school is a lot bigger. It's a lot more diverse, and now things like research and this gradient of work from art to urbanism can breathe, right? They can breathe, and they can come together with the professional programs where they need to, but the professional programs can also do what they need to do. So I think that was not the project I came here with, but ultimately I think this structural realignment will allow me to get back to those egg-headed issues that I was lecturing about when I interviewed.
Excellent. That's really good. And there'll be a small exam. Everyone has to diagram that, leave it in a ballot box, and see if there are any right answers. But basically, it's a much broader, more complete idea of a school, which just before we have the session, we had an exchange of emails, which will be in the next exhibition of the School of Architecture, where each dean laid claim to doing this, that, and the other. And then we had a conversation by phone that was longer than this conversation, and we barely covered the turf. I went outside the lines. I asked my friends to send in their questions. And so the first question is for Larry, is what do you see as the most significant change or shift that occurred during your tenure as a dean, a cultural shift, like things in motion when you were the dean over that 7-year period? And that's from Ante.
You mean things that were happening out in the world?
Yes.
The shifts that were happening that...
1997 to 2004. So,
well, Ante. Wow. Okay, thanks.
It's a CNN broadcaster.
Well, two things come, this is a big question, but two things come to mind quickly. One is that we were really in the midst of the so-called digital revolution. I mean, it had already started, but when I arrived in 97, I sensed, well, I knew, like the world was changing. Things were changing very, very quickly in terms of the digital, and the school was very, very far behind. So I've had a long-standing interest in that. I'm a kind of a klutz with computers myself, but I had written and theorized and speculated about the importance of the digital. I mean, I was writing and doing drawings and so on about that in the 80s, and I became more and more aware of that new world we were living in, the real world and the virtual, and that it was going to have a big impact on architectural education, as it has had. I would say the second thing is just, again, the kind of dynamics of globalization and the awareness that had evolved by the 90s, that we were living in a totally interrelated set of conditions globally, and that the school had to be a part of that conversation about how one lives in a world in kind of radical flux, and that there was no longer any single truth, and that it had to be a school where people could engage in all kinds of possibilities, all kinds of futures. So I'd say the kind of radicalization of things around us through the digital, and the kind of acceleration of the global, those are two things that were always around me and impacting on me, I think.
George, this one is a Brian Boygan or Boygan-esque kind of question, but it was really...
Is it a Brian Boygan or a Boygan-esque?
I reworded it a bit, so it's a Boygan-esque question, but it has to do with something I always wondered about the role of the dean, especially you. The question was what is your project? That's the Boygan part. What is your project as an academic leader and as a public intellectual? Whether you can, at this point, I mean, your writings have just been published, which is really great, but the question is, can you just pin it down? This is a great... No, there are lots of things I wanted you to say, but this is sort of what I think I'd like you to say. And then he had a follow-up, which was, he wanted to understand whether you, in your tenure as dean, what risks did you take? And it could have been on people, or on programs, or on initiatives. So the first one is really, at this stage in your intellectual life, like being able to say, my project is and continues to be, or has...
Well, having previously billed myself as such a nice guy, I'm now going to kind of turn on that remark and say, I'm not going to answer that question. Somebody else should answer that question. I mean, I've published 6 books, and the most recent of which is relatively recent. And the truth of the matter is, having published the last book, right now I don't actually have a project. How about that? I'm kind of mulling things at the moment. So, but well, here now having stopped being nice, let me for a moment even be vain and say, my name has been mentioned enough times today that maybe my answer to the question would also be redundant. So there. But I will answer the second question, and that was when, in the middle of my deanship, Ron Daniels, who was then the dean of the law school, came over to me in the dining room at breakfast in a hotel in Houston, Texas, where he and I happened to be attending completely separate academic meetings. And he said, "George, I've been meaning to talk to you. I think there's a possibility my uncle might give some money to the faculty." Ron Daniels is the nephew of John Daniels. And I knew from Larry that Larry, I think it's fair to say that John Daniels is the, one of the wealthiest alumni of the school, maybe the wealthiest. And Larry had certainly, in his fundraising explorations, had the name of Daniels come to mind, and had actually met with John Daniels.
Well, and Ron had actually invited me to his office in one of his green leather Corbusier chairs, and sat me down and planted these ideas as well.
Okay. So in any event, I remember a remarkable night in November. Ron had said, "Okay, I'm meeting my uncle and his wife in New York for Thanksgiving," and he was at this time, he'd left U of T to become the provost in the University of Pennsylvania. So Ron was taking the train from Philadelphia, and I was flying from Toronto, and he and I and John and Myrna Daniels were going to meet for dinner in the restaurant in the Pierre Hotel where Mr. and Mrs. Daniels had an apartment. Basically, we negotiated an amount of money over that dinner, in which came to $14 million. I must confess, my heart was kind of in my mouth through. It was a nice restaurant, but I confess I don't remember anything about the food. But I do remember walking down Fifth Avenue afterward and phoning my wife in Toronto on my cell phone and saying, "Elizabeth, he's giving us $14 million. Oh, and just to wrap it up, then there was another $500,000, then another $500,000, and then another $10 million. So, but Richard gets the credit for the last 10.
Okay, I think, Richard, I want you to just talk about, and maybe the three of you can work this around, but I'll start with Richard about just the relationship of the faculty to the university. And I think this is that moment of the relationship of deans to their campuses and the relationship of the school to the city, which has really changed exponentially since 1997. I mean, this is a different place almost, so intensified.
Well, those are three different things. The relationship of the faculty to the university as an academic institution, the relationship of the faculty to the university in its capacity as a city builder, and the third thing is the faculty's relationship to the city. The last two maybe I think should be intertwined, but let me talk about the first one. So George has talked about the Daniels gift, and I think that was very critical to changing the perception of the faculty's prospects at the central administration, because faculties that are poor and have their hands out, I have found now that we have changed our circumstance, are given very little breathing room and very little autonomy to imagine things and to operate independently. I see that it's still a struggle for the Faculty of Music and some other faculties. And it was always, we were either going to be absorbed into a larger faculty or find a way to become solvent. The Daniels gift was the first thing, I think, that said, oh, this place has some possibilities. Now, the thing that that I think, but even still, when I arrived, the provost at the time, Cheryl Misak, said, "Well, your faculty's a little bit hurly-burly," and we still needed to do a lot of work to bring the faculty into the community, if you will, and we still do, of the university, but having undergraduate students, and Larry and George and I talked about this, even beginning of the time that Larry's in, having undergraduate students who are here but are also participating in classes and in activities and in the culture of the school beyond the professional program orbit, I think has gone a long way, and increasing the size of that activity is continuing to help in that. And I think being successful in fundraising has also done that, but also the realizing that our faculty, the quality of the faculty and the faculty's achievements, not only in Toronto, but our faculty and our recent alumni, their achievements nationally and internationally, and I've tried to do a lot to amplify that and to make the administration aware of that. So that then gets to the something that Larry started, which is the faculty's role in the university's activities of campus building and city building. And Larry's published a book on the design of the campus and was instrumental of several presidents back with Rob Pritchard, who, by the way, Rob Pritchard was a very young dean of the law school, coming from Harvard. I think he was in his 30s. At the time, this school was going to be closed, and when I met him, I had lunch with him when I first came here, he said to me, I went to this meeting at the center of the university, at the governing council, or maybe before that, and they announced that they were planning to close the school, and I raised my hand and I said, this is Rob Pritchard. He said, is this a discussion or a decision? And he was one of the people in other divisions that said, an important university has to have a school of architecture. So I think he was actually a very key person, I know, working very closely with Larry, not only in the discussion around the saving of this faculty at a very critical time, but later someone who recognized the value of the activities of this faculty in elevating the role of architecture on the campus. And Larry was very active in bringing some international architects to build here. And I think we've tried to continue that. It waxes and wanes, I have to be honest, based on the willingness and the vision of our leadership to support architecture. We hopefully, I think, now have a president who talks a lot about city building and the university's role in that. And so I think for us, just to hook this all in, I inherited a project because of the Daniels gift. The 10 million of it was tied to the building of, or to the transformation of our
capital.
Our capital.
Yeah.
10 million of the capital was tied to building or expanding these facilities, and the thinking at the time was that we would renovate this building and we get about 20% more space. When I got here, Barry had done incredible work on the programming of the building. George had organized an international competition, but we didn't get the federal funding, and I realized pretty quickly that we needed to do something bigger to actually excite the ambitions of our donors, including Mr. Daniels and others, that wanted to see something really big, this faculty do something really big. So I inherited not only this great faculty, but also this kind of nest egg. And I think framing this project for One Spadina was one of the ways of, along with the gift of actually getting a lot of attention from the university and the city about the upward trajectory of this faculty as a story. So I'm not sure if that's an answer to your question, but
that's good. That's good. Larry, I want you to. We talked about Detlef Mertens in our conversation. I just want you to just give the audience a sense of his contribution to the idea of the school.
I'm very happy to do that. Before I say a few things about Detlef, I just wanted to add to this conversation about the university level and leadership at that level and vision at that level. I think the importance of that just can't be overstated in terms of architecture schools. There are 12 architecture schools in Canada now. we could all in our minds, you know, of course starting with U of T being the best, go on down the line and rank them. But, you know, there are a lot of schools that struggle for this reason and that reason. And a lot of the struggle simply you can track back up. If you don't have a president who cares deeply about architecture amongst his or her other divisions, if you don't,
and urban design,
and landscape, and urban design, and visual studies, and anyway, you're going to be in trouble. And there's some schools that, unlike this school, which fortunately is a sort of standalone faculty with a dean, a lot of the other architecture schools are at the mercy of a dean of engineering or a dean of this or that may not be really sympathetic and may not provide the leadership. So, and the last thing I want to say about that before I come back to Detlef is that you mentioned the book that I did on U of T and campus planning. Well, George wrote the foreword to the book. And in that foreword, actually George sets out the 3 presidents of this university that cared deeply about campus planning, architecture. It wasn't so much about the architecture school, but it makes a big difference. And the last thing that I would say is that you were mentioning the importance of Rob Pritchard, who sort of helped save and rebuild this school. He did undergraduate studies, I believe I'm right, Shirley can help me out or somebody here, at Swarthmore College. And he did an elective course as an undergraduate on architecture. And I will always believe that one of the reasons he cared passionately about this school and about architecture is because he'd had that undergraduate course. And it kind of links back, I think, again, to at least my sense about the importance of the undergraduate liberal arts program and the broad base.
But wasn't it also Pritchard's vision that all of the professional schools should exist at the graduate level? So that was part of his plan for the university, that you actually had to, you were in the position to transition the school from a BArch to an MArch, actually because of his idea that University of Toronto would become an internationally ranked research university.
That's right. And then Adel Cedra, who was provost at the time, was really key in the transformation. Well, Bruce, thank you for mentioning Detlef Mertens. Many of you in this audience will either studied with Detlef or knew Detlef or know him because of his scholarship and his books. Detlef was a graduate of the school. He went on to do a PhD at Princeton and was a very key faculty member here. And Detlef worked with me very closely from 97 till 2000, a little bit after that. I mean, there were very key people like Detlef Mertens and Rob Wright and Barry Sampson and Kamala Prabhakar, and there was a team. But Detlef was really extraordinarily helpful in helping reframe the curriculum and in enabling all of the levels of approval. I mean, to get sort of 4 programs approved in 2 years through the whole university system, and the PhD was sort of ready to go. Detlef was enormously helpful and worked very closely with me through all of that. So this school really wouldn't be the way it is without Detlef's input from that time. And of course, he was an extraordinary scholar and went on to become the chair at University of Pennsylvania, at Penn, and then sadly passed away a few years ago. So it's fitting, I think, to mention Detlef.
Yeah. I think what I'd like to do is to begin to open it up to the floor. This is pretty much a one-time unique event where you can have the 3 deans and ask them anything you really want to know. I mean, there are other questions. I mean, they're easy questions, but I think anyone, you can see the kind of quality of leadership and the consistency of their ability to articulate the issues that they faced in their time. And I think it's been a very steady construction of an intellectual center at the University of Toronto that's in parallel with the growth of the city. And it's been sustained over a long period of time. Richard said, I don't want to answer anything about the future. I didn't mean it. You know, and to which I said, the future is when we leave this room. It's right out there. And but I would like to, maybe Dale can help, but this is your chance to field any question you'd like. One thing we did agree on was that we weren't going to wear ties. So here for the science people, a tie will increase your body temperature 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Of course, Larry, we didn't talk about color, but Larry, you know, who's the designer?
He's got a wicking shirt on.
Okay.
My name's Sheila. I was teaching landscape architecture here, and I was also a student here. And I'd like to thank all three of these men, because there are a lot of people at the head of architecture who had no appreciation for landscape, and they were different. The other thing, when you mentioned Rob Pritchard, when I was teaching, he came in and talked to our first year class in landscape, which was extraordinary. I've never heard of a president doing that. And he mentioned that he said he just wanted us all to know that he was very supportive and he was really glad we were there. And it was so inspiring and gave us such confidence, the people teaching and studying. But he also mentioned something. He said that if he thought he had the talent to be an architect, that is what he would have studied. So it's very interesting to hear your background stories today.
Great. We'll get a question out of Bridget. And then...
Hi, my name's Bridget Shim. I had a quick question. First of all, thank you so much for a huge amount of effort to build the school to where it is right now. I'm very sorry that Blanche Van Ginkel is not here. And in a way, I think that the issue of women within the disciplines of architecture, landscape architecture, urban design is a kind of evolving one, and maybe we could actually have a sort of comment about that in relation to not the past, because that's already history, but maybe the present and the future and where we're going with that.
Let me just say a little bit about Blanche. We thought right away when we were organizing this to invite her, and she accepted. And then she was going to come, and I think she had maybe some dental surgery 2 weeks ago. So she was going to come, and then I think it was she felt a little bit stressed about being on the panel, and then I tried to talk her into coming and not being on the panel, and she was up until yesterday going to be here, and she's very much here in spirit, and I've promised to take her through the exhibition, which I think she will really enjoy. Blanche was still coming to meetings when I arrived, so there is still that continuity, and if she didn't like something that I was saying or doing, she would definitely stare me down. And I could tell very quickly what she was buying and not buying. So I could tell that she was a very formidable figure in her time. Around the issue of gender, you know, everyone in this audience will know that it's been many, many years not many, but I think it's been at least a generation that schools of architecture and landscape architecture have had women in terms of the classes at almost a level of 50%. But it was because of the tenure system and because of the system of appointments, there was a lag between the character of the student body and the ability of schools to make appointments that reflected those student bodies. And today, it's not only the issue of women, there are lots of other issues of diversity and global ethnicity and identity that I think are important for a faculty in a place like Toronto to represent. But so I think that some faculties lagged behind. This one, I think, caught up very quickly. Sometimes between Larry and myself, but you always have to be vigilant to keep your eye on. You know, if you we have juries, we must have 50 people come in at various times at the end of the semester, and if you're not if you don't think about it and compose those juries, I still can walk into a room here and see a line of men in the final jury. So it remains a kind of a consciousness that we have to maintain.
I mean, Blanche was extraordinary to our generation because she and her husband, Sandy, were introducing concepts of urban systems and looking at transportation and even their Ginkle van, and but in ways that wasn't being done within the core curriculum. She was looking at the expanded field that others had talked about, where architects could actually look at whole systems of cities, open space systems, pedestrian systems, and that was an eye-opener. And for that, I will be forever grateful, because she expanded our view and really laid some groundwork for us.
Can I add something to the Blanche Van Ginkel story? Since I've decided I owe her an apology. Blanche was first the director and then the dean of the school between during the 80s. And it was a period of time when the school was caught in the ideological tension between the protagonists of the curriculum, which had been introduced by John Andrews and Peter Pragnell in 1968, and another group of faculty who wanted to expand the range of things under discussion and to kind of open up the school to some other possibilities. And this was a period of time when, as many of you in the room will remember all too well, the faculty was not collaborative. Blanche was first director and then dean while that was going on. And it was in the run-up to the proposal of the provost in 1985 that the faculty be closed. So as you can see, these were not easy times. I would say that I was prominent in one of the factions in this dispute which had been proceeding in the school. And I think it's fair to say that in those years, I was as wary of Blanche as the director, first the director and then the dean, as the protagonists in the opposing faction were, because neither of us was exactly sure to the extent she was on our side. But in long retrospect, given that the school did survive all that, and probably the crucial period is a bit after Blanche stepped down, but it did survive all that. And I would say in long retrospect that she navigated a very difficult political situation in the school with considerable skill. And I think her contribution in that regard has been underestimated, not least for myself. So one of the reasons I'm sorry she's not here is I would have enjoyed saying so to her face.
We still can.
And then we're going to go over there, and then I'll go to you.
Scott Francisco, class of '94. It's a great honor to be here in this room with so many familiar faces. One thing that seems to be, to me, a little bit of a gap is the culture of architectural education as it exists kind of independently of the administrative structures. And, there's foundations and structure, but there's also this ecosystem that seems to be so resilient in the face of many things. And I entered in a time when there's still a sort of close memory of the school being almost shut down. And that was a really big part of the culture here that actually, I feel like, spurred on. And I'm sitting with some of my graduating class here. Can some of you just speak to that culture as something that may exist somewhat autonomously of some of these structures? I mean, funding is great. Administrative support is great. Is adversity ever great? Is that something that actually builds a stronger and more robust and resilient culture at times? And how have you navigated that over the years that you've been here?
I think the culture changes. There is a great, the studio system, the system of studio education produces a certain social ecology. But I would say, to come back to a question that's come up before around the effect of the digital, I think that I think less, or I'm less focused on the digital tools as they've now come to be extremely integrated into the design process over the course of my own teaching career. But the broader effect of digital culture and the fact that students are doing the work on computers and that they have a whole world of things at their disposal does change the culture of the school and the necessity, for example, it either in some ways increases the need for collaboration and to be in a place, but it also gives certain students and certain sensibilities the ability to work almost entirely autonomy in a way that was not at all familiar to me as a student. And I think as we transition to our new building, and even as dean, I have sometimes struggled with that because I'll wander around upstairs. There's a certain culture of students that are here all the time, and there are some that, I make this joke, they can be designing their stuff at home in their underwear, right? So I think that while there is a constant, I think that it has to do with the transmission of certain values and ideas about design from generation to generation. There are just as many disruptions. And one of the advantages I've had as dean is we've described certain continuities. When I got here, Larry had hired a lot of people. I think George was extremely trusted and built a very collegial culture among the faculty. And so I was able, and I've been able to do very difficult things, strangely, without getting a lot of pushback. In fact, our former president, Naylor, said to me about a year in that he was flabbergasted that he had not had people marching into his office from the faculty because of the things, the changes I was trying to make.
Were they marching when George and Larry were there?
No, I don't think they were. But I had to do some I've had to do some, enlarge the programs, shift our building project. And I think it's because of the collegiality and that was established by my predecessors. But I also, so when I came, I think at one of my first faculty meetings, I did something. I said to the faculty, we are not in the business of reproducing ourselves, because the environment of practice in the world is changing, and this is something I feel very strongly. And I think it might have been the same meeting where I then put up all the research performance of other schools of architecture in North America. I remember particularly McGill, whose published record was higher than ours. And I said, well, we may think we're great, but there are other ways in which we're not great. And John Schneer, is John Schneer here?
Yes.
John Schneer asked me if I had served smoked meat sandwiches for any purpose during that meeting. But I think that the great advantage was that we can have great differences and great differences, and there is almost sometimes a mind-bendingly large difference in the sensibilities and backgrounds of our students, probably much even different than your time. We have many students who are first generation, who are coming from different parts of the world. 20% of our students are actually international students in the graduate programs, same percentage in the undergraduate programs, and I'd say another 50% that are counted as Canadian students are within a first generation. So the diversity of sensibilities and the diversity of expectations, even who lives at home versus who lives on their own, produces a much different culture than I think existed in the school here 20 years ago, and it's something we always have to keep our eye on in relation to this digital question as well, because they don't need us to get information. We're more like curators. I think it's like what Benjamin was saying in the last panel.
Yeah, I think this was an interesting question, because I think that we tend to talk about how things can be kind of happily coordinated and the importance of the happy, productive, collaborative community. It's extremely important, but at the same time, I think friction, certain types of adversity, and so on can be good as well, because I think, did you use the word resilience? I don't know if you used that word, but to be an architect, landscape architect, urban designer, you need a huge amount of resilience. These are like extremely tough professions, disciplines, endeavors, and you have to be really tough. So I think if things were like at one extreme, if they're all kind of too nice and sweet and happy, that's not so good either. So that, but at the same time, like the school can't kind of go over the edge into like warfare, right? Ideological warfare. So it's a matter of kind of balancing and keeping things, because it's kind of constantly in flux. And I think you have to be on guard, like, are we, going off the edge of the cliff? I was struck earlier in the day by Michael McClellan's comments about the time when he was a student here. Michael's on the front row, and you were kind of talking about the fact, well, people were pulling this way, people were pulling that way, but you were in the midst of all of that, and you said you sort of thrived because you had to figure it out for yourself, like you weren't being spoon-fed, and it was kind of as I understood it, a sort of a tough, crazy time. But you kind of came out all right, I think you're doing all right.
I could add a couple of comments to that myself, and they're both historical. The first one, when I first started teaching at the Architectural Association in London in 1966, I remember going to a panel discussion of some of the faculty one evening, which I thought sounded as though it was going to be interesting. And I got there, and I couldn't believe the kind of belligerent criticism going. Cedric Price was one of the people on the panel, which is one of the reasons why it was so stormy, but he was not the only one who was expressing vehement opinions, scathing remarks about his fellow panelists and their architectural ideas. And I remember sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, I've just got here and look at this place is in kind of turmoil, intellectual turmoil. And then finally the discussion ended and everyone retired to the bar. And I discovered all these same people sort of sitting around with drinks in their hand, sort of joking. It was a considerable shock to me, actually. And then the second story I will tell is one Jorge Silvetti told me, who was the chairman of the department during my latter years when I was teaching at Harvard. And he told me when he came, Jorge joined the faculty of the Graduate School of Design at Harvard in 1975. And in 1975, it was still the case that on the day of thesis reviews in their big auditorium, which a number of you will know, Piper Auditorium, where all the thesis reviews were scheduled to take place, the procedure that was part of the protocol that was still in place circa 1975 was that along one wall of Piper Auditorium was a full bar. This is 10 o'clock in the morning when the thesis reviews are about to start. So this is to say that architectural educational patterns change. I have seen, Larry's already talked about, too much discord is a problem, and not enough discord is also a problem, and I absolutely agree with that. But one of the collateral victims of, asymmetry in those regards is damaged students, I don't see it happening anywhere in schools anymore. Maybe it still does, but I well remember, ideological disagreement between members of the faculty or members of the faculty and outsiders taking the form of attacks on student projects, which
we don't do anymore.
Well, I don't think so. And
well, there must be students in the audience.
It's a good thing.
Are there students in the audience?
We try not to do.
One hand went up. Okay, we're beginning to wind down. I think what we're going to do is there's one question. Oh, Trevor, we got one question.
Obviously it's time for a drink if George is bringing up the subject. Trevor Bode, I'm just off the plane from Vancouver and caught the second half of this. Much of it is, by the nature of these things, institutionally reflexive, and good on you. But what I'm hungry for, from my outsider's perspective, is a little bit more in either an exhibition or a symposium like this about the creative works that have emerged from the school and its graduates. I really appreciate the mention of Detlef, who I fought with but learned from, et cetera. And I'm just wondering, maybe each of you give a few suggestions for the creative works, buildings, books, urban plans that have emerged from the graduates, which might be part of an agenda of that sort. To find those in the exhibition, you really need a magnifying glass. It's a textual, contextual exhibition, but maybe just propose a few works that you could begin with that would chart the impact of the school elsewhere.
I would say, Trevor, the earlier part of the day was framed to show those things. So, and you probably didn't see that, but I'll let my
Look, let me start, and I'm not going to talk about works, but I would like to talk about people, because there's a few kind of recent incidents converge in my mind here. One of them was an expression of some dismay on the part of someone in the audience who thought that the kind of role of the somewhat notorious figure Peter Pragnell was kind of insufficiently recognized in the deliberations of this event. I'm not saying I agree with that, but I think it's consequential that comment was tabled. And then while I was mulling that over, I happened to be involved with a couple of colleagues who were getting ready for the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the construction of the Toronto City Hall. And that put me in mind of the astonishing role of another member of the faculty of this institution, Eric Arthur, after whom Larry named our exhibition gallery. And so, and I've been thinking about this since. I mean, in his presentation this morning, I was very interested that Jerry Markson referred to the faculty that taught him in his time in the school as, quote, nice guys. And I've already said that I was here from 1957. Well, I started in 57. I was a student in the school from 57 to 62. And, well, there were a lot of nice guys in the school then, too. And probably a fair number of them were the same nice guys that had taught Jerry only 8 years previously. So that, if you put the curriculum, the 1968 curriculum introduced by John Andrews and Peter Pragnell into that context, you can see why students in that year, like Bruce Kuwabara and Barry Sampson, found the new curriculum so electrifying. And there's no doubt that it was so for several years. Not enough years, in my opinion, but several. So I'll just sort of table that. Then I had another epiphany of this kind this morning when we suddenly saw the photograph on the screen showing Michael Huff and John Andrews and Michael Hugo Brunt together with a model of Scarborough College in the foreground. A project, by the way, initiated under President Claude Bissell, one of the other presidents in the history of the university who took architecture seriously. And then many of you, like myself, will have seen the exhibition, which is, of course, extremely interesting. And there's some talk that it might turn into a book, which I think is a great idea. And pursuant to Trevor's question, I was just going to suggest that it would be one of the things that the book could benefit from that the exhibition doesn't quite have yet, for me, would be a kind of sense of the role of major figures in the history of the school. And there's no doubt that John Andrews would be on that list, and Peter Pragnell would be there too, but they would not be alone. Blanche would be on that list. I'm only going to talk about people who are way back. I'll bring this forward into the present. And then I remember, even in the days of the nice guys that taught me, James Ackland single-handedly saved the old City Hall from destruction by City Council. And he was a history faculty teacher in the school. And for several years, his kind of full-time hobby was leading his campaign. This was before heritage preservation in Toronto even existed. James Murray virtually invented housing design in Canada. And then towering over them all is Eric Arthur, who was an intellectual and design leader in this school for 4 decades, from the 20s until the 60s, who founded the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario, established heritage preservation in Canada before it even existed, in English Canada at least, before it existed anywhere else, was the editor of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada Journal, was the constant promoter of the idea of the architectural competition as a kind of sort of vehicle for the execution of major projects, and who then, of course, went on to become the key figure persuading the Toronto City Council to adopt the competition model and, leading to the competition which was held and to the design of the building which we have today. So I can imagine a book version of this exhibition which would provide the valuable documentation the exhibition does, but that would assess the careers of these kind of giant figures who, rise above the level of the nice guys in the various generations of the school's history.
Richard. So I'm going to toot George's generation's horn a little bit, which is I'm a newcomer to Toronto, but the city of Toronto and the vitality and I think the exuberance of its downtown is owed to those people who were very active in the late 60s through the early 80s. People like George with projects like Vacant Lottery, but also Ken Greenberg, who was a student here, and then went on to be extremely and still is extremely influential and many others that I'm not going to mention. The fact that Toronto's zoning and the kind of intensification that we see now is happening, it didn't just, even though it looks like the product of laissez-faire investment, didn't just happen by accident, and actually was, I think, very much driven by people who were anchored at this school. That's just one example. I could toot the horn of some of our more recent faculty. In fact, Graham was speaking earlier, Graham Stewart, and he really was, with others, instrumental in the tower renewal and in a new generation doing what needs to be done now, which is looking at the suburbs. So I think there are projects, but I do want to defend our curators and the people who were put this exhibition together, because this material and the ability to kind of step back and see this, there is no archive. And in fact, we sent students into the basement because we're preparing to move, and they were digging through dusty boxes and books and calling people on the phone and interviewing people, and what you see on the wall there is everything that they could conjure in the last 6 months. And the ability now to kind of step back and look at that and say, what are the broader things, I think would be an amazing exercise.
Yeah, could I just pick up on, I wasn't sure I fully understood your question or your suggestion, Trevor, but in a way, well, but also maybe beyond that, there's a sort of sense, is there an identifiable thread through all of this? What are the kind of defining characteristics, right? And there, maybe if we all go into that exhibit every week, and I mean, it's very, George used the word, I think, density earlier. It's a very dense exhibition, but amazing material and research that's been pulled together in a very short amount of time. But I think it's a step towards maybe eventually then identifying threads that go through the 125 years. And, some of those you can begin to speculate on. We've talked around them already. The school's very close relationship with the city. I mean, you can't divorce what the school is from the city of Toronto, and that's a very complicated and interesting discussion. But then also, early on, somebody mentioned that the school's been so fortunate to have practitioners and this sort of laboratory of architecture. I mean, that's one of the reasons students come to Toronto to study, because they know they can study with great, in addition to academics and researchers. They can study with fantastic practitioners. And then there's the sort of laboratory of the city itself. And things, you know, Eb Zeidler is here, and we can name lots of other key figures in terms of the last 40 or 50 years in building.
Most of whom have taught here
in
at some
building
point.
this city. Yeah. So I'm sorry, I'm starting to ramble now, but I think it's the exhibition and the events of the day are a step towards those possibilities. But it's going to take time to do that carefully.
There's one question, one last question, and this is it. We're into overtime now.
Everybody wants to get on to the party, but the reason I came today was because of a comment that George made regarding the conflict in 1980 to 85. I'm a graduate, 84, and my professor then for my thesis was Peter Pragnell. I was born in Toronto, so I know the city. I felt a bit like the faculty were my parents and that they were always at each other. And it was really unfortunate because I was enjoying and learning from the likes of Carmen Corneille, Mark Baroness, Peter, Noel, and still to this day, I don't really understand why it had to be that way. Blanche interviewed me when I came out of high school, and she said, this is going to be difficult for you as a female. And I didn't have a problem with that. What I had, my biggest problems were the rifts between the faculty. And in my view, it didn't have to occur. So that was the past. In the future, I would like to see a broader spectrum, perhaps finance incorporated into the program, such as I'm a current graduate of the Appraisal Institute of Canada, and perhaps something in that regard, or engineering. I've learned a lot from my AACI designation, and incorporating some of those courses, as UBC has a monopoly on those right now. So I had to study online with regards to those. I think that could be an expansion. And that's it. So if I could perhaps hear publicly from George regarding that time, and perhaps Bruce, just on your views, and that would be it. Thanks.
I'm going to pass the buck on that. I won't speak for Bruce. And my reasoning is as follows, that I've already made an argument for the work of the exhibition, which I did not in any way, by the way, mean to disparage, to be kind of amplified in the form of an analytical published volume, which I think is a great idea. And I think the challenge you laid down would appropriately be answered in such a volume.
Yeah, and I think that I wish we had a bar in this building. That we can continue that discussion. It's very important. I think that, you know, when I talked about Larry and that there's a kind of degree zero, there's a very dark period, and I think you have to really understand that. I think it should be talked about, but it's going to take more than a kind of public session with deans to actually get that out. It was troublesome and fearsome that the school would be closed because of all that sort of.
Well, that wasn't the only reason.
There were many reasons.
Yes,
economic.
Let me tell one more anecdote, which ties a couple of themes we've had already nicely together. One of the things you discover when you become the dean is that you have access to all the files, which you didn't. So you discover things
Really?
that you didn't know. So. Like the last question, I had thought that the proposal coming from the university that the well, it was the provost of the university, not the university, that the faculty be closed was because we were seen as so troublesome by the Central University administration. All right, this is hardly a surprising reading of the situation. Well, lo and behold, then I get to be the dean, and I'm going back through the historical documents. And what do I discover? I discover that the provost of the day was a woman called Joan Foley, who was one of the first women in the administration of the University of Toronto to attain such a high-level administrative position in the university. And there were a surprising number of peer male administrators who resented the fact that this woman had got to be appointed the provost of the university and that they hadn't. And they took it upon themselves to make her life as provost somewhat difficult, being the first woman in such a role. And this was a period of time when the university overall was in fiscal difficulty, and so gradually their campaign to put the heat on the new female provost coalesced into a proposition that she show how tough she was by shutting something down. And who should loom up on the horizon as a possible victim? As I said, I had thought it was to do with us. And I suspect, we were there were certain circumstances that made us the available victim. I'm not denying that. But the fact of the matter was that that was not the primary consideration. The primary consideration was that the first female provost of the university was being harassed by her male colleagues into doing something precipitous to demonstrate her toughness as a senior administrator.
Wow.
How about that?
On that happy note.
By the way, Bruce, I think everyone that went through that period should know, you probably do know, that many other schools of architecture were threatened with closure too. UBC the year before this one, and others in North America. So this is a period when a very precarious place for schools of architecture in transforming universities. But the particular complexion of it here is fascinating.
Yeah, no, it's complex. So listen, I want to thank, first of all, Larry, George, Richard, really, I think quite extraordinary leadership, all different styles, different voices, different impacts, all building, I think, the school that is quite amazing to me. As a graduate, I want to thank the audience. One of the great things about the event is, you just see the generations, and it is a generational thing, and I hope that for all of you, you've learned something about the school, you sense the possibility. I think, just to answer Trevor, that we've got the best faculty in the country right here. I told Phyllis that when she asked me. I think we have a very strong school that is everything that all three of them have put in place. It's very international. Toronto is a very interesting city. It's a great place to be here and in education at this moment. I think we have incredible talent. I see it. We have people who are graduates of the university and students working in our office, and I see just the quality of their thinking. I think we have, the project is to really, in a way, resolve and unify our alumni. I think that one of the big holes in the school that needs to be strengthened is alumni. Which is what this event is really designed to do. And I've talked to Ty Farrow, who is very active and a leader in his generation, but it's going to take leaders. I see Astra, who has been a leader. I think it's going to be a big effort, and I think we have to put a lot of effort into this. We have to pull this school together. I think it's been really a great afternoon. Thank you so much.